was born with the gift of the gab. With MagMongoSlade. Shoot. He don't miss.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about Sergeant Slaughter's WWE biography on A&E. A very good documentary. Excellent, even. They went into his life, backstory, career. They even went into the controversies. Very little into the controversy of him being a fake Marine for 30 years or something like that. I want to spend more time there because that's the one unique element of Sergeant Slaughter's story over the typical wrestling story. We've heard the story of dad's never around, my husband is never home. We've heard that story before. But one of the stories that makes Sergeant Slaughter very unique is that he is in the Hulk Hogan bracket of liars. I mean, the guy lied for 30 years. They were lying as recently as 2019 about Sergeant Slaughter being in the military. I think they lied in 2020 about him being in the military. In fact, I think this is the first time in public that he has ever said that he was never in the military. I think this might be the only time that he's ever done this. And of course, they tried to cover it in kayfabe. Oh, I was in character all that time. It's classic Hulk Hogan stuff. I love it. It's so carny. Put it in my veins. This is what wrestling is made for. Wrestling, these guys have been exaggerating everything. They're 5'8". They say they're 6'1". These guys are 120 pounds. They say, let's round it up to 250. But when it comes to being a Marine, and he did it for 30 years, and they go back to trying to disprove this guy back into the 80s. It was for years that they tried to disprove this guy. They proved it a long time ago, but it never really got the traction until the internet era. Then it started to really pick up that Sergeant Slaughter was never a real Marine. So let's go backwards a little bit. We're going to get into the biography. But let's talk about the controversy of him being a fake Marine. Now, he in the biography talked about the creation of the Sergeant Slaughter character. He was beautiful Bob Remus, and he was working Minneapolis and in the AWA. He was barely getting by. And then he saw a movie. It was called The DI. And the movie is called The DI. It was an old movie, black and white movie, that featured a drill instructor. And that's where he got the idea for the character. He got the name from another movie called Soldiers in the Rain. Vern Gagne, who actually is a real veteran, by the way, which is the interesting bit about this is how many real veterans have been A-OK with Sergeant Slaughter. But then we get into recent years and everybody's like, oh, you can't do that. You can't say something is not real. In any event, Vern Gagne liked the gimmick. He starts, booking him as Bob Slaughter. He starts going on tour a little bit as Bob Slaughter, went down to Kansas City, worked around, and then he ended up over being Super Destroyer Mark II in the AWA for a while, which kind of put his Sergeant Slaughter gimmick on the shelf. Then eventually he went to Charlotte, where they kind of really skipped over his tag team with Don Kernoodle, which is one of the greatest tag teams of all time. Very popular and very profitable tag team in the Mid-Atlantic territory. They kind of skipped over that a little bit. But the idea is that he was talking to his good friend, Pat Patterson, who was going to go work in the WWF. He gave Pat Patterson some pictures, and Pat Patterson showed these pictures to Vincent J. McMahon, who then turned around and brought Sergeant Slaughter in. And he ended up being one of the most popular characters in the WWF pre-WrestleMania. So from 1980 something to 1983, right? So this entire time, Bob Slaughter is telling everybody he was a drill instructor in the Marines. So there's an article that comes out in the Baltimore Sun. It's called Mom, Apple Pie, and Wrestling. It is published March the 24th, 1985. And the author is Michael Davis and Mike Klingon. Or is it Klingman? Anyway, in it, they expose Sergeant Slaughter. Robert Remus never served time in the U.S. Marine Corps, though he claims to have been a drill instructor from 1966 to 1973. Slaughter dodges all questions about his armed service record for good reason. The U.S. Marine Corps Public Affairs Officer Jay Farrer says, "We've been interested in Slaughter for a couple of years since he began using our paraphernalia, but the guy has been very elusive." He says that that his office has received 50 complaints in the past year from True Blue Marines citing Slaughter's abuse of the uniform. He continues, "What they really didn't like, and we know of 2 such cases, is when his opponents staged attacks on people wearing dress blue uniforms, whom we strongly believe were not Marines. Then Slaughter came in and rescued the guys." Let's pause right here, because this is too juicy to pass up. The Marine Corps, well, this captain, Jay Farrer, he was upset that, I don't know, maybe he watched it on TV, maybe he was in the arena, who knows. But 2 guys were wearing Marine Corps uniforms. He doesn't believe those 2 guys were Marines, and maybe they weren't. But they were getting beat up. And then here comes Sergeant Slaughter to make the save. Very stereotypical for baby faces, especially in the 80s. And that offended him. That upset him so much that he decides he's got to expose him and try to stop this. Now, granted, Sergeant Slaughter had been a heel for a long time, calling people maggots and he hadn't even done the worst stuff he was going to do yet under the name Sergeant Slaughter. But the fact that he saved 2 other guys who were all of these people are dressed like Marines, by the way. So it's like a Marine saves other Marines. It's supposed to be good symbolism. You're supposed to believe in the troops and all this kind of stuff. But this upset these guys. They're really tight-assed about this whole Marine Corps thing. Oh my goodness. You take it so serious. Anyway, let's move on, because I understand. Let's move on. So there's nothing they can do about it because, he's in character or whatever. And they said the USMC, the United States Marine Corps, could do little until last fall when Congress passed a law prohibiting the use of the Marine Corps emblem and insignia by civilians. So Captain Farrer says that gave us recourse to fight back. He continues, well, the article continues, that his office, Captain Farrer's office, fired off a letter demanding that Slaughter stop because his actions, quote, reflect discredit on those who have served. Neither Slaughter nor his former Connecticut agent, Mark Sotiechek, replied. Captain Farrer says, "Our next step is to try and get the U.S. Attorney's Office involved. From a public relations standpoint, it may not be worth the effort. You've got to look at this broad-minded. Sergeant Slaughter isn't a bad guy. He's trying to uphold good things. But he's abusing something that Marines hold near and dear to us, just for showmanship." Slaughter's response, "We have no comment on that." I've been trying not to laugh this entire time, but who cares, man? This is ridiculous, all right? You're spending taxpayer money to go after this guy. All you got to do is tell him, look, we understand it's a gimmick. We don't, these guys probably don't believe in wrestling anyway. They don't believe it's real. So just tell them, as long as you tell everybody, as long as you're a good sportsman for the Marine Corps or whatever, as long as he's a babyface, just let him do it. When he turned heel, however, and he's being the heel Marine, okay, maybe now you want to complain a little bit. Sort of like the Mountie. And I know everybody up to this point was probably thinking, didn't this happen with the Mountie? It did happen with the Mountie. For those of you who don't know, because maybe you're too young, Jacques Rougeau, who was in WWE as one of the fabulous Rougeaus. Of course, in the early to mid 90s, everybody got a new gimmick. His was the Mountie. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police actually complained that Jacques Rougeau, who is actually Canadian, he's real Canadian, French Canadian, stopped portraying the Mountie because it made them look bad. Now, the Mountie was a heel and he had a shock stick. So you will understand that he is, this is not a good guy. He's torturing people and he's wearing our uniform. That sucks. We don't want that to happen. Okay. But Sergeant Slaughter, again, in 1985, he's a good guy. If it was 1991 and they were like, Sergeant Slaughter, you've gone too damn far. You're saying you're an Iraqi sympathizer and you're saying you're a real Marine. Hell no, we're gonna stop that. It would make all the sense in the world if they just stopped it during the height of the character being, in public or whatever. Now the character is still very popular because he had already begun his promotional run with G.I. Joe, which is what I really think this is about. Is that, and they talked about it in the documentary, that Sergeant Slaughter became so popular that he was contacted by Hasbro to be in the G.I. Joe product line, which he joined, unironically, in 1985. So the same year he joins G.I. Joe and becomes one of the top action figures in the entire country, the U.S. Marines are like, no, what are you doing? You're profiting off of our paraphernalia. That's what's going on here. I don't know why anybody just can't say that, considering it's far more understandable. If you were a real Marine and you see somebody's making a ton of money by being play acting as a Marine, you would get kind of tight-assed and chaffed about it, And then to know how much money this guy was actually making for your sons, and especially your sons. I was about to say sons and daughters, but daughters maybe as a wrestler, maybe not as much as the action figures, but as a wrestler, you see him on TV all the time. They're saluting him. He's in interviews saying that he was a real Marine. And he's raking in tons of dough all over the place. And you're sitting there thinking to yourself, this is not fair. It's not right. And you know what? I would actually be on your side if that was the argument. If the argument was, you're not a real Marine, you're a pro wrestler, you're acting, you're doing this, it's probably not best for you to make money off of our paraphernalia. If you want to just be a baby face and run in and save people and it's part of the show, fine. I mean, it's just like police officers. If you're part of the show, you're part of the show. But when you take it outside the show and you're going in interviews saying that you're a real Marine and you're not, when you are selling merchandise as if you are a real Marine and leading other people to believe that you are a real Marine as you sell that merchandise, that's unfair. Now, the government does get their cut either way because I know he paid income taxes. So some of that money made over to the Marines. Some of that money made over to the Marines, but I get it. It's not just the silly uniform. It's also the profiting. It's also the lying in public. All this kind of stuff is very, very interesting. And again, he continued telling this lie well into the 2010s. All right. So it wasn't just, it was the character in the 80s and that was it. No, he continued this. And they continued calling him out. We're not going to go through the exhaustive history of Sergeant Slaughter claiming in public that he was a real Marine, or the many times that he's been called out. But let's go into some of the more recent times. In 2019, Sergeant Slaughter did an interview with Fox News where he told that story again, that he was once in the Marines and he got into wrestling after he was in the Marines. This got pretty much everybody upset. This is what got guys like David Bixenspan, the SoCal Uncensored guys, everybody who went on the entire 2020 rant to try to straighten the record about Sergeant Slaughter. All of this stuff happened because of those guys. And then an article came out in the Marine Corps Times, which is the one they actually showed a little bit of in the documentary. This was from February 27th, 2020, where we actually get a little bit more of a breakdown that Sergeant Slaughter was never in the Marine Corps. Now, at this point in time, 2019 is an interesting bit because Sam Roberts, and he was in this piece too, because he was part of the interview. He was the host of the show that Sergeant Slaughter was on when the thing actually blew up. So Sergeant Slaughter goes on Sam Roberts' show, and he's talking about basically being in character, etc. And he says, quote, Sergeant Slaughter is just a character that I portray. I didn't start out as Sergeant Slaughter. I just went as myself. But the Marine Corps Times, they were still upset. And they said, quote, Bryant said he didn't buy WWE's contention that Remus was discussing his time in Vietnam as the Sergeant Slaughter character. He says, quote, the interview, he's talking about behind the scenes stuff, how storylines come up. Bryant told Marine Corps Times, is clearly not in character. But he also clearly just said that it's just a character that I portray. Anyway, Bryant said he was troubled by the comments because of all the troops who died in Vietnam or came home with post-traumatic stress. More than 14,800 Marines died in the Vietnam War, according to National Archives. Remus said on a radio show that he decided on the Sergeant Slaughter character after seeing the 1957 movie, The D.I. He said, quote, I started watching it and I said that's a hell of a character for a villain in professional wrestling. And it panned out pretty well for me. And they kept, they're now nitpicking, right? The argument is, well, is he in character or is he not in character? Which means he's a worker's worker. If you can't tell whether it's real or not, that's actually the mother's milk of pro wrestling, right? I don't know if this guy is real or not. I don't know if this guy's talking in character or not. It's like, well, that's kind of the point, right? That's the point. But these guys really made it a big deal. So this Bryant fellow, he is the co-founder of SoCal Uncensored, what is a wrestling blog. And he really went in on this. He took this thing to heart. He really ran with it. He even went so far as to try to FOIA request Robert Remus's records just to get a letter from the Navy saying that he was never in the Marine Corps. I mean, he went to such great lengths to prove something that nobody really cares about. And that's really what the saddest part about this whole thing is how little people actually care if Sergeant Slaughter is a real Marine or not. And that's really been the sad bit, is that, these guys put so much effort into something that, to be quite honest, most people don't care that much about. It's about, these guys who go out of their way to try to figure out how really tall Andre the Giant was. Because there's no way you could be 7'4". There's no way he was 580 some odd pounds. Like, okay, it's wrestling, man. Chill. There's certain things that do matter when it comes to the truth. And it's nice to know that Sergeant Slaughter was never a real Marine. But going to such great lengths that we're writing, 10,000, 20,000 word exposés and we have to constantly talk about it. It's like, okay, we get it. He's playing a character. We understand. Sylvester Stallone was not really in the army. Rambo is not real. We get it. Relax. Okay. Just chill. The real reason, I stumbled across an article. David Bixenspan wrote an article in Mail Magazine about Sergeant Slaughter. And you already know how David Bixenspan is. If you don't know, he is one of these very highly political types. So he probably would not have ever cared that Sergeant Slaughter was playing a character for 35 years, lying in public about being in the military. He probably wouldn't care about that. The reason why he did care is because Sergeant Slaughter on Twitter had a short conversation with Jack Posobiec, who is a right-wing political commentator. So Jack Posobiec says, as a veteran, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Sergeant Slaughter for creating an amazing character that inspired millions of Americans, many of whom ended up serving. He has always been there for the troops. This was in January of 2020. Sergeant Slaughter responded, finally someone gets it. Finally someone recognizes it. Finally someone understands who Sergeant Slaughter is. God bless you, Jack Posobiec. God bless all who have. God bless all those who are serving our country, and God bless America, home of the free, because of the brave. And this really got everybody's, this is a bug up everybody's ass. But that's what this whole thing was about. If you read that David Bixenspan article on it, that's what this is about. Jack Posobiec, and right wing, and he just, of course, started slobbering and drooling all over his keyboard. But that wasn't the only thing that was talked about in the documentary that I thought was actually pretty interesting. They also talked about, of course, the Iraqi sympathizer gimmick, WrestleMania VII, why Sergeant Slaughter decided to do it, and what the plans were and how they went awry. So I want to talk about that too, because that's also extremely, extremely interesting. So, as you know, Sergeant Slaughter wins the WWF title in 1991 from the Ultimate Warrior. He is going to wrestle Hulk Hogan. Vince McMahon pitched him the idea before he came back that they were going to main event the Los Angeles Coliseum. They were trying to sell 105,000 seats in this building. Sergeant Slaughter's eyes got big as quarters because he wanted to break WrestleMania 3. That was his entire modus of wanting to participate in this thing. He was willing to turn heel to do all of this work because he wanted to surpass the attendance record of WrestleMania 3. But as things went on, they decided to lean into the Gulf War, which made the character an Iraqi sympathizer. Now, here's where we go into an article by Mark Madden, which was in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from February 1991. Now, in this article, a couple of people who are close to WWE are interviewed by Mark Madden about this character. One of them was Bruno Sammartino, who said, quote, "I'm appalled that WWF would capitalize on this. I'd have spit in Vince McMahon's eye before I let him involve me in something like this. This is the worst thing ever done in wrestling. Don't forget, I'm from Italy. I saw half my own town wiped out by the Nazis. It's tragic that parasites like McMahon, Hogan, and Slaughter would do something like this for money." Wow. He was the Bret Hart of his era. Like, I'm appalled at this. I saw wrestling Nazis all over the place during my day, but this is the worst thing that could ever possibly be done. Jesse the Body Ventura, a real Marine, by the way, had a conversation about this, and he says, "It's only wrestling. I don't feel good about the exploitation of war, but it happens. Flag sales are booming now. That's making a profit from the war. Every time Saturday Night Live does a skit about the war, that's exploiting it. Would I do it? No, but I'm a vet. Slaughter isn't." So even if you thought that he was going to escape this whole thing, it's not. It's not. Jesse the Body Ventura told people in public that Sergeant Slaughter was not a real vet, and of course you would have known that if nobody ever would have done an Iraqi sympathizer gimmick if they were a real vet. That's ridiculous. The WWF publicist says the reaction of the fans is not as severe as the reaction of the media. We've had very few complaints from the fans, and they are a primary concern. The Slaughter angle started before the war. We didn't ask for the war. Now, one of the things that occurred, WrestleMania VII, of course, it was supposed to be at Los Angeles Coliseum, 106,000 people. They were trying to beat the Pope, who had done like 100,000, and that was the plan. Now, what they didn't talk about in this documentary is they talked about the move from the Coliseum to the sports arena, which you've probably seen a myriad of people from Meltzer and Alvarez and all these guys talking about it, because it was seen as one big, Vince took a L and he had to go from this huge, massive Coliseum to this very small building because they weren't selling enough tickets. Now, if you actually read the ESPN article in 2018 about this, it actually puts things into a more full context of what occurred. Now, Bruce Pritchard was the guy talking in the biography. Don't trust Bruce Pritchard. But what Bruce Pritchard did say is echoed throughout quite a few articles around that time and people who looked back on it. So ESPN in 2018 did a sort of retrospective on WrestleMania in Los Angeles. And Joe Furin, which was the general manager of the Los Angeles Coliseum at the time, he told the entire story that they actually were willing to pay WWF money at the time to come to the Los Angeles arena. They actually pitched to Vince. They made a 6-minute video package that they sent to Vince McMahon in 1989, but Vince ended up going with somewhere else, and in 1991, it was finally time to do it. Now, Joe Furin did the popularity of the WWF in the sports arena, which was next door to the Coliseum, and how big a deal they figured it was, and how they were building it up for a year to be the biggest show ever. And then the Gulf War happened, So this is what WWF is playing off of. They're playing off of the Gulf War. And as tensions ramp up, people are more and more skittish about being in large groups. There's a news article from Deseret Magazine, or Deseret News, dated January the 23rd, 1991. Fears about terrorism has Super Bowl 25 feeling slightly skittish. And in the article, you can see that they're talking about the security measures that are necessary to get the game on the field. But you really get a sense of how the time was. In another ESPN article, it says the story of Whitney Houston's epic national anthem performance at 1991 Super Bowl. So they talk about it here, where you get a sense of how crazy things was. It says a coalition of countries led by the United States drops real bombs on real people and real places in real time on 4 networks. This was the first Gulf War. There are no color-coded threat level advisory posters on the airport walls, but the State Department and the Secret Service agree. The possibility of a terror attack is high, and Super Bowl 25, the Giants versus the Bills, scheduled just 10 days later, is a soft and glaring bullseye. The Goodyear blimp grounded. A Black Hawk patrols instead. Commissioner Paul Tagliabue's annual Super Gala canceled. Concrete bunkers gird the parking lot of the old Tampa Stadium, and a 6-foot-high chain link rises quickly behind that. Canines sniff chassis, and ushers wave metal detectors. SWAT teams walk the stadium roof with machine guns. Alternate dates due to fear of mass casualties are considered for a Super Bowl. And I want people to recognize that, yes, there is quite often times where people like Bruce Pritchard and WWE are full of shit. But the fear around WrestleMania VII and that large venue and securing that venue is very real. And all you have to do is look at sources that were from other venues, okay? That's all you had to do. So, yes, they had to change the venue. They didn't sell as many tickets as they wanted to sell. But if you go back to the other ESPN article I did from 2018, that was the maximum for the LA Sports Arena. They stopped selling tickets 2 months before WrestleMania. So they sold between 14 and 16,000 tickets by the beginning of February 1991. That was the maximum for the LA Sports Arena. Again, this is 2 months before WrestleMania. So they don't know what kind of walk-up they're going to have, but they do know that the cost of securing that building ain't doing nothing but going up, at least at the time. So they made the decision to go to the LA Sports Arena, where the maximum seating was about 16 to 17,000. The attendance ended up being a little over 16,000, which ended up being the full for the building. But it ended up not being anywhere near the 100,000 for the planned. And Sergeant Slaughter in the biography is talking about, how disappointing that was. And that, people were suggesting he walk around in a bulletproof vest. And the amount of heat that he had in the death threats. And this is how he ended up getting divorced from his wife, because he had put so much effort into attempting to break the WrestleMania III record that he had put his family in danger. At least his wife felt that he had. And she left him. And this was a real humanizing moment for pretty much, especially since I'm watching this, you have to say, well, I kind of understand. Like the girls they were born in 1970 something, so they're not like children, but you have essentially a stalker that I think he mentioned in here, who knows where the kids live, knows what schools that the kids go to. They're extremely scared. I have not been able to independently verify that the FBI was watching after them, even though Sergeant Slaughter has routinely said that the FBI was involved and watching over them during this time. They had armed security, all these sorts of things. But it was a difficult time, But that wouldn't be it. In the documentary, they mentioned that there was some business issues as well with the Sergeant Slaughter character and the Sergeant Slaughter gimmick. And one of them being that they were bleeding sponsorships. There is also, an article that Bob Costas was supposed to make an appearance at WrestleMania, but he chose not to due to the Sergeant Slaughter character. So there was a lot of business reasons why this thing ended up being a kind of a disaster. And it had nothing to do with the ability to draw money or the popularity of the brand. It had a lot to do with people being off-put by the war, people being, well, the war exploitation, I guess you could say, and that people were, scared of going outside, that there was a lot going on at the time. And on WWF television, they actually showed this. I don't remember it. They had Sean Mooney actually apologize on television and say that the thoughts and feelings of Sergeant Slaughter don't represent the WWF and all this kind of stuff. This was after they did the Photoshop of Sergeant Slaughter with Saddam Hussein. So there was so many different things. Like, I think WrestleMania VII could probably be its own documentary. The WrestleManias that are involved around real world issues could probably be their own documentary series. Like, this is tremendous when you really start looking at WrestleMania 7 and all the things that are going on. I'm not even talking about the talent yet. I'm just, this is just the business element of it and how it surrounded it. They ended up making this thing actually into a bit of a boondoggle. And it's fascinating stuff. I wish they would have spent more time on this, but of course, you're talking about Sergeant Slaughter. You're talking about this guy. They talked a little bit about Sergeant Slaughter being, a backstage personality, and how he was for a long time involved with recruitment, and he was helping with vignettes. So he was a producer, and there was basically a lot of stuff going on that, led him to the Hall of Fame in 2004. Then at the end, of course, they talk about the Stolen Valor, which he says that he's always been in character. So it was a really good documentary. And Sergeant Slaughter is a guy we don't talk enough about, mainly because he was already in his 40s when most of us were kids. This guy was, I think, 43 when he main evented WrestleMania. He was already not in his physical prime. The character also was not in its prime anymore. It was in its prime in the 80s when I would have been damn near a baby. So it's an interesting look into a wrestler that spanned into my generation, but just at the tail end of his career. And though I wouldn't rank Sergeant Slaughter as being one of my favorite WWF champions of all time, he is an incredibly memorable character and an incredibly memorable persona. And, he's fun. I know that he's not a real Marine. I don't know, I've got to say that. But Undertaker isn't really dead. And Undertaker didn't do interviews in character, but most other people did. It was actually commonplace for wrestlers to do interviews in character. The fact that Sergeant Slaughter hung on to the gimmick for so long, though, is especially unique, especially since he was, exposed in 1985. And he continued even to 2020, still claiming that he was in the military, which is very odd. I don't know why he would do that. But between the controversies around the character, the controversies around WrestleMania 7, it's a fascinating documentary. Hopefully you guys watched it and enjoyed it. Thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you later.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, Daddy.